So today I'll be doing something that I actually haven't done here on the channel yet before, and when I make fantasy videos, which we've been doing a ton of here lately, obviously with the 2021 fantasy season approaching rapidly, so if you haven't done so already and you're new around here, you should definitely go down and click the subscribe button, and while you're at it, turn the bell on, give this video a like. But nonetheless, when I tend to make videos, I'll either do an individual player breakdown and analysis. I just did Saquon Barkley last week. This week I'll be having Josh Jacobs coming for you in a couple days here. Or I'll do something where I just zone in on one particular position group. I'll do wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, whatever it is that day. I'll be doing either some players I really like or some players that I'm fading off my draft board. Today we're doing something completely different. We're looking at one specific team here, and I'm just going to be doing a deep dive into recapping their 2021 fantasy football production and then projecting what I see that translating into for the 2021 season. So today we're starting out with a team I'm rather familiar with and more comfortable with here, with the Green Bay Packers, obviously my favorite NFL team, but don't worry, I'm going to be completely objective with this. I think I'm actually rather harsh on the Packers and how I see their fantasy season playing out here, obviously with some Aaron Rodgers drama going on right now and some other things. I see some regression in for this team for the 2021 season. So let's hit the intro. Let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right in to the Green Bay Packers 2021 fantasy football outlook. Depending on how this video goes, I might be putting out 1 to 2 of these every week here, and I'll be starting out doing the first place finishing teams for every division. So hopefully getting, in the time that we have before the season starts, access for all of you to the top scoring fantasy offenses that we had in the league last year. So obviously I'll be looking at the Bills, the Chiefs. We'll dive into probably the Ravens, the Steelers will be interesting ones to take a look at. Tampa Bay, obviously, the Rams, the Seahawks. You get the point here. So we're going to be looking at, I'm going to push the lesser fantasy offenses to the back burner for now and be taking a look at the ones that have the most fantasy relevant players on them so that we can at least get some relevant content out here, because I don't think I'll ultimately get through all 32 teams here on the channel before the season kicks off. But if this does well, this is something to look at for as a lot of future videos next season. But an overlook of and a quick recap here of the 2020 season for the Green Bay Packers. The number one scoring offense last year, they had the most points for in the National Football League. That's pretty standard when you have the MVP Aaron Rodgers on your team, and if you have the MVP on your team, which is almost always an offensive player, that's probably to be expected. They finished first place in the NFC North, again, looking for more relevant teams to start things off with here. And then they had a 26-6 record from 2019 to 2020. So, again, a very sound football team, a very good team, and a fantasy group that we can look at for some pretty productive numbers here. So it's time to take a look here. We're going to break down some of the fantasy stars, the most productive players in this offense last year, and then we'll ultimately get into some additions, some departures we had from the team last year, and look at how I see that playing out for this 2021 season. But obviously the star of the show last year was Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback 3 in 2020 fantasy football. He had a monster stat line last year, 4,299 passing yards, 48 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions, and once again, he was the league MVP. At SFS here, we actually have something in our draft guide collection where we rate players and have consistency ratings to figure out just how dependable a player was in a week in and week out basis. We have various metrics and stuff for that and baselines for scoring. And Aaron Rodgers earned our highest honors for consistency ratings with the Consistency King honors. You can see that as a feature on some of our merch that we've got on sizzlefantasy.com and whatnot. But it's our thing that we do around here. So what we are ultimately looking for in SFS is we want players that we can depend on to most consistently give us top-end fantasy football production. That's what Aaron Rodgers was in 2020, and we'll talk about how that projects him for the 2021 season in just a bit here. But nonetheless, Aaron Rodgers, he was a monster last year and was one of the most dependable fantasy quarterbacks. Therefore, he earned that Consistency King badge that you'll ultimately see once his draft profile is completed on sizzlefantasy.com for the 2021 redraft kit. Next up, though, we have Davante Adams, who honestly might have been even better at his individual position, finishing as the wide receiver 1 in just 14 games. He had 149 targets, 115 receptions, a ridiculously high 18 touchdowns, and 1,374 yards. Davante and Aaron Rodgers is an unstoppable combination. Davante's been one of the best wide receivers in the red zone for the last 5 years. He has the most touchdowns by a mile since 2016. So a really productive player here. He's got some pretty nice stats going for him in the last 3 seasons or so, and when he's been healthy, he has been a phenom. In the last 2 seasons that he's played 14 or more games, he's went north of 10 touchdowns and 1,300 yards both times. So a very productive wideout option, a player that I think is one of the safest, and I think he is still the wide receiver 1 for the 2021 season, but we'll get into that here in a bit. Aaron Jones out of the backfield, their top running back, finished as RB6 last season, and something we're going to talk about later is the rushing offense projections for the 2021 season. I'm expecting a big year for Aaron Jones after a quite lackluster, and to say lackluster for an RB6, I think is something that you wouldn't hear too often, but there are some things that were working against him last season and that I think have bounced back into his favor this year that I think will ultimately project him for some very, very nice numbers this season. And then Robert Tonyan, I think this one was something that nobody saw coming. Tight end 3. Like, how did that happen? Tight end 3 in 2020 fantasy football. We'll talk about Robert Tonyan's fantasy value as well today. That was a monster year. He, of course, had 52 receptions, 586 yards, and a whopping 11 touchdowns, which led his position. I think he actually tied with Travis Kelce with that touchdown marker. But nonetheless, Tonyan way outdid himself last year, and we'll break that down, like I said, again, as we get into this video. So, some key additions for the Packers this season. There you can see rookie Amari Rodgers, 3rd-round pick out of Clemson for the Packers here. He'll be playing the slot role, and Coach Matt LaFleur has already talked about Amari Rodgers as a player who I'm starting to think sounds like a lot like Randall Cobb, who you can see other side in the backdrop here. I think that he has the potential to be highly utilized in this offense, and a player that we haven't really seen since Cobb's departure. They've been looking for one of those smaller, shifty guys to come out of the slot and catch a high volume of passes in that phase of the game, but lately the Packers have had basically an entire lineup of wide receivers above the height of 6 feet tall, so it should be nicer to see a smaller and shiftier player at the position, but we'll, again, break down Amari Rodgers in a little bit here. And then, not technically an addition via free agency, but they're getting Devin Funchess back via the opt-out, and I'm actually not going to dive too much into Devin Funchess today because I don't see him playing a major role in this football team, so I'll give you what I have on Devin Funchess here right now. I think that Devin Funchess ultimately falls somewhere between the wide receiver 4 and 5 role on this football team. I think that if Aaron Rodgers, and we'll talk about the Aaron Rodgers-Jordan Love debate and whether or not he's going to be playing quarterback for this team in a little bit as well here, but I think that Devin Funchess is best fantasy value, and I think that this is the standard for most fantasy players on any team would play better with Aaron Rodgers, and I think that'll be the case here. But I see him being used virtually just as a red zone threat. He's been a touchdown guy throughout his career, and he's got a larger frame. He's not too fast, so I don't see him being too much of a deep threat or an every down receiver. But I think that as a player who is usually going to be used in the red zone, that bodes better for a seasoned vet like Aaron Rodgers to get him the football down there and score some points. Maybe it'll be a nice stream here and there, but I don't think he'll have a consistent lineup value or production potential. I think that just at the end of the day, we'll talk about who I think would benefit from Jordan Love being the starting quarterback in Green Bay, but Devin Funchess is certainly a player who I think has a limited role as is and an even more limited one if Love is to be the quarterback here. And then by far the biggest departure of 2021 for the Green Bay Packers was Jamaal Williams. The RB40 doesn't sound that significant, but he was a really nice handcuff to have if you had Aaron Jones around on your teams last year. He played a lot of snaps, a lot more than people realize. Jamaal Williams was in on 40% of the snaps for the Packers offense last season. So literally we're talking about a player who was a backup running back playing, not almost 50% of the plays, but like a significant share of the workload Jamaal Williams was in on for. He had 150 touches last season, which again is something you wouldn't expect to see out of a reserve running back, but Jamaal Williams carved out a really nice role for himself on this team and was not only used a lot as a runner and a guy who got the ball out on the goal line, but he was used as a receiving back a lot as well. And I think that's something that people don't realize about Jamaal. A very underrated receiving threat and a player that could get out there and catch the ball in space and make some plays happen. So he's a physical back, but he can also juke a little bit. He's kind of shifty, not terribly elusive, but definitely a player who can make a defender miss every once in a while. This departure is the thing here as we get into the running game for the 2021 season that I think has the biggest impact on things Between the 2019 and 2020 seasons, Jamaal Williams saw a 5% increase in his snap count here in Green Bay. So he went from 35% in 2019. That's still just above a third of the snaps that he was in on for that season. He went up to that 40% marker, which is quite significant. And going into Aaron Jones here, as again, I'm going to be talking about the running game now here for the Packers. He only played 52% of the snap count in 2020 for the Packers. That is not very much. 52% is barely over half of the amount of the plays the Packers ran last season. He was absent on the field a lot more than I think a lot of fantasy managers realize. Jamaal Williams was completely taking over series, and even A.J. Dillon, who we'll talk about in a sec here, he was in on 15% of the plays. So there was some times when they had multiple backs on the field, but a lot more than people realized Jamaal Williams was the only back on the field or A.J. Dillon was the only back on the field. And that plays a pretty significant role when you're talking about the amount of volume or a workload that a player can actually receive, because Aaron Jones had a 10% drop from the 2019 season. He played 62% of the snaps that year, and if you remember correctly, he was the RB2 finisher that season. He had 22 total touchdowns, rushing and receiving combined. Obviously, in 2020, that went down to just 11. So not only did he see a 10% drop in his workload or actual ability to be on the football field, he also saw a 50% decrease in his touchdown production count. So a lot of things went against Aaron Jones last season. He saw reductions in basically every statistical category from that 2019 season. I think things, though, no more Jamaal Williams. He's got A.J. Dillon there still, but I think that that's going to play a big factor in things here and increase the amount of workload he ends up seeing this season. So we'll move into A.J. Dillon now and talk about why I think that Aaron Jones, despite having a second-round pick come in behind him at running back, we'll still see an uptick in his touches. So A.J. Dillon is going to be on the field. I would expect him to see roughly the same amount of opportunity and snap count sharing that Jamaal Williams saw in 2019 with that 35% marker. I think A.J. Dillon will be somewhere around that 33% of the time he's on the field and whatnot. But the main difference that I see here that will give Aaron Jones that top-end production and fantasy value that we're looking for is A.J. Dillon is not an overly productive receiving threat, and that's something that Jamaal Williams, like I touched on, very underrated in that phase of his game. A.J. Dillon's a clunky pass catcher. He's more of a physical bruising back, and we saw him run the ball very well against the Titans last season, for example. But he's not going to be a player that comes out of the backfield, catches swing passes on a regular basis, and makes defenders miss in the open space. That's just not his game, and that's something that you can't really change at this point in his career. And while the Packers might want to use him as that type of a threat, it's not going to be a good situation if they try to do that. So I see Aaron Jones re-securing some of that receiving work in this offense. And again, because A.J. Dillon's only a second-year player, Jamaal Williams wasn't even seeing that 35% snap count percentage until his third year in the league. So I think that you see the vet here, Aaron Jones. They just signed him back to a big contract. He's going to be on the team for, if he plays out the duration of that contract, 4 more seasons. He's going to be the guy seeing the majority of the work here. I don't think he'll ultimately get back up to that whopping 22 touchdown count, but I think that we might see him get into the mid-teens, high teens even if we're lucky, and that receiving volume, that receiving work that was, again, another very crucial part of that RB2 performance and upside that we saw in 2019 start to come back into his game a little bit here. So Aaron Jones, kind of the only player I see actually increasing his fantasy production from 2020 to 2021. There's going to be a lot more of trending down that you see throughout the rest of this video, and I think that that's something important to note. But I think the running game for the Packers is going to be the phase of things where we can expect an increase in production here. We're getting into the passing game now, so now it's time to talk about, obviously, is Aaron Rodgers going to be the starting quarterback for the Green Bay Packers week 1? I think, taking my Packers fandom and whatnot out of the picture, I think that the only team Aaron Rodgers would potentially suit up for week 1 is the Green Bay Packers, and this is the reason why. The GM, Brian Gutekunst, is not budging on his stance of not trading Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love. He refuses to take calls. He's not really entertaining the idea of moving Rodgers. So I think if Aaron Rodgers is playing football come September of the season, it will be in a Packers uniform. I don't think that he wants to play football for the Packers. I think that we're in a pretty rough and ugly situation right now. But if Aaron Rodgers, so I've got two scenarios laid out here. If Aaron Rodgers is to be the starting quarterback for the Packers week 1, I see his 2021 fantasy outlook pretty much being an averaging out of his past 2 seasons, and here's why. Virtually nothing for Aaron Rodgers and his situation in Green Bay has changed in those 2 seasons. He's got almost the same weapon core that he had in both seasons. He didn't really see a major loss of anybody that he's throwing the ball to. Again, didn't really see a major acquisition of a player either. Devin Funchess and Amari Rodgers, 2 new faces in town, not going to make a substantial difference, I would say, in Aaron Rodgers' overall production value. In 2019, I think a lot of people would say Aaron Rodgers had a very below average season. He only threw 26 touchdown passes, and he was pretty much subpar compared to the rest of the standards set by him in his career. And I think 2020, his numbers were a bit inflated. It was a really elite season, won the MVP award, but that's not production that we can expect for a long time frame and to be reoccurring over a multi-year basis. So averaging the 2 seasons out, you get Rodgers paced out at about 37 touchdown passes, 4,150 passing yards, and 5 interceptions, which has been pretty much standard for him the last 3 seasons now. Obviously, one of the safest players in the National Football League with the ball in his hands, doesn't put it into risky situations, rarely throws turnovers. So Rodgers, 37 touchdown passes isn't bad, and I think that that's something that if you look at his career as a whole is pretty much the mean of what his production level has been throughout his career. 37 TD passes where he's being drafted right now. That's a fairly fair rate, I would say. And again, for a player that doesn't turn the ball over very much, you're looking at a top 6, 7 quarterback and a player who's being taken right on the money at that spot in draft boards right now. So Aaron Rodgers, I think he's worth his value if you end up picking him and he ends up playing. That's the big thing, first of all. And second of all, I think that the next part of this that we can really like to see is that I don't think any player will see an overly large regression if Aaron Rodgers returns to the Packers as the starting quarterback here. I think that once we start talking about Jordan Love, there's one player who I think will be relatively immune from seeing regression with him under center, but there are a lot more players that I think take a hit and find a fantasy impact if Jordan Love is the starting QB. So that's what we'll talk about right now in situation number 2 with Jordan Love. I have him ranked as QB 0 for the 2020 season because he never suited up for a game, didn't play anything, he has no stats. He didn't even, like I said, suit up for a single game. He was the 3rd string quarterback for the Packers from day 1 till the finish of last season. So when I was trying to think about Jordan Love and what I would like to compare him to, what other player in a similar situation I would connect him to try and put, some context and perspective behind his fantasy value and what I think he can be as a passer in year 1, if he's even just average. And I think that, a lot of Packer fans, the biased thing to do here, if you're a Jordan Love believer, if you're against Aaron Rodgers, is to say, well, his top end comparison has been Patrick Mahomes. I love Jordan Love. I love the Packers. That's just not realistic. I think that we can hope for him to be a nice starter, but again, we're staying objective here, trying to keep this video as unbiased as possible and put things through a realistic scope of mind. And we're not talking about winning games here. We're not talking about who's going to win the NFC North. That doesn't matter for the sake of this video. All that matters is the raw numbers these players produce as fantasy football players. So the thing that I connect Jordan Love to, and I think that a nice middle of the spectrum landing spot for him to be, that I think is, again, very realistic for us to expect of him, is I went back and I looked at Kirk Cousins' 2015 numbers, the first season he had as a starter for the entire 16-game regular season schedule. Kirk Cousins, who I would say is a very middle-of-the-pack quarterback in the National Football League. I don't think anyone would say he's an above-average talent by any means. I don't think they would say he is an exceptional producer, an elite fantasy producer. He had 4,100 passing yards, 29 touchdown passes to 11 interceptions. That's fairly average. I mean, that is right about in the middle. You're going to see about a range of maybe QB 10 to 15 numbers depending on the year. And I think that's realistic for what we can expect out of Jordan Love. I think anybody would tell you that from a raw talent perspective, Jordan Love probably has a better arm talent than Kirk Cousins. I think that they would tell you that Jordan Love is a better athlete than Kirk Cousins. And I think that what you might be able to say as the ding against Jordan Love is he's unexperienced. He's a bit raw as a player, and he might get off to a slower, clunky start. These are all fair criticisms. These are all fair points to make about him. And that's why at the end of the day, while I think he does some things better than Kirk Cousins, I think it's fair to say that Kirk Cousins is also a professional. He's a very refined passer. He knows how to make the open read, find the correct player. So if we average things out here, I think it's a very fair comparison. And like I said, I look back at Kirk Cousins' first season as a starter, not his most recent one because he threw 35 touchdown passes, was a very productive quarterback. We're looking back in time here to the 2015 season. So if this is the case, if Jordan Love is able to throw for the low end 4,000 passing yards numbers, high 20 touchdown pass numbers to low 30s, a little bit over double-digit interception numbers. We're looking at, maybe 10 to 15 picks. I think that gives us enough fantasy value and enough wiggle room to squeeze in some players as still being able to have your Davante Adams, the top-end fantasy producer, and even having some other wide receivers on this depth chart. Robert Tonyan, we'll talk about him as well, being able to at least sustain their fantasy value from the previous season. So we'll jump into those players right now. So Davante Adams, if Jordan Love or Aaron Rodgers is the starting quarterback, I do not think it makes a big difference. Why? Jordan Love, we can expect regression from the offense as a whole. We can expect the numbers to be not as great as Aaron Rodgers was. I mean, he's a second-year quarterback. He did have all offseason to learn, and he is preparing right now as the QB1 in camp. But it is slightly unrealistic to expect those numbers from him. Nonetheless, what is a guy like Kirk Cousins doing who's putting up these very average numbers? And I just talked about Kirk Cousins actually the day prior to this video coming out as one of my favorite must-own quarterbacks for the late rounds of 2021 fantasy drafts. Nonetheless, he's putting up relevant fantasy numbers for Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. These are two very, very talented wide receivers like a Davante Adams. So with the talent level, with the capabilities, if Davante Adams is in good health, I still expect him to be able to put up top-end receiver numbers. I think that he's the wide receiver one regardless, because if Aaron Rodgers is his starting quarterback, Davante Adams will have these crazy efficient numbers that we've been seeing for the past few years now. I think that 18 touchdown marker is bound to come down, probably closer to 10 to 12 touchdowns. I think if we're being optimistic and want to hope for a high-end upside, 14 might be the ceiling for Adams this season. But nonetheless, if Jordan Love's the quarterback, we can expect Green Bay to not only lose more football games, they'll probably be trailing late more often, and they'll probably be having to throw the ball more because they're just going to be less efficient offensively. What does this mean? More volume for Davante Adams. I think that while he might not be seeing as much yards per target, as many yards per reception, he's going to see more and more looks, because what's a young quarterback going to do? They're going to lock on to their veteran receiver, their dependable face in the offense, and they're going to throw him the football over and over and over again because they trust them at the end of the day. So I think Davante Adams, regardless, will have a very nice fantasy season and be the productive player that we're hoping for out of him. But these next players is where I really see the drop-off start to occur at. Robert Tonyan, this is a player that regardless of Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback this year, who, again, I'm expecting a drop-off in his touchdown count. I had him paced out as 37 touchdown passes for this coming season as opposed to 48 back last year. Robert Tonyan's going to see some touchdown dip as well. He caught 52 of 59 passes last season, only 7 incomplete passes when targeting Robert Tonyan in 2020. That's just not going to happen again. He was insanely efficient last year, and that just isn't something that you can turn around and translate year to year. I've got him going down from 11 touchdowns to 6, and that's even if he's able to play the full 16 games as a starter. Or I keep saying 16, but it's 17 now. It gets me every time. If he plays every game as the starter, I've still got him regressing by 5 touchdown passes. His 560 or so yards last season was fairly subpar and average. I've got him going up to about 600 yards, but that's still not going to make up for the lost production from those 5 touchdowns I've got him falling off from. So Robert Tonyan, to me, is a low-end tight end 1 in fantasy. He was a high-end starter. You see tight end 3, like best of the best last year. I just don't see that happening again, and he's like literally shaped himself to be George Kittle and like molded his entire like persona around him and his play style. That's nice. He's like baby George Kittle if you want to, but he's still not going to be elite fantasy producer. I just don't see it happening. He caught almost, as I said, everything that was thrown his way. 7 incomplete passes is ridiculous, and 59 targets to begin with is like a third of what Davante Adams saw, just over a third of that. So he's not getting a ton of volume. He's being way overly efficient with the looks he's getting. I think that this is just a situation where if we're reaching on Robert Tonyan in 2021 leagues, we're going to get burned. So approach him with caution this season, especially if Jordan Love is the quarterback here. I think that, you can talk about tight ends being a player that's close to the quarterback and they like to check the ball down to him, but Tonyan was doing the most of his damage as a deep threat last year and scoring plays over the top and down in the red zone. So not too much upside, I don't think, for Robert Tonyan. I think the floor is pretty shaky as well. I would probably stay clear of him, and you can take him as a tight end flyer, and if he starts to go off your board too early, let it go and don't think twice about it because it's probably an overvaluing in the first place. Another player who I think has a lot more value with Aaron Rodgers on the field as opposed to off the field is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, MVS here. Wide receiver 49. He had the highest yards per catch in the National Football League last season. That's awesome and all, but when we talk about Aaron Rodgers and how good that deep ball is and how good the accuracy and the placement of the football is when he throws downfield, for a young quarterback like Jordan Love, if we can't expect that in year one, and if that's something that's shaky and consistent, he's going to have struggles getting the ball and getting points up on the board because he only had 2.35 receptions per game with Aaron Rodgers on the field. He played 14 games and only had 33 receptions. So he's a big play guy. That's what he is. He was honestly better as an all-around player his rookie season, but since then his volume has dropped off and he's just kind of resorted to being the downfield threat. And he was really good at that in the NFC Championship game against Tampa. But we got to see something else. Like, he has to be utilized differently or something because his best production comes when he runs straight down the field. And I think that that's something that, again, a young quarterback like Jordan Love, if he's trying to fit the ball between a safety and a corner deep to Scantling, I don't love that situation. So he's a Rodgers play, and even then, probably a wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4 flex streamer against bad defenses. Maybe you want to stream him against a Detroit, but not a player I would invest too highly into fantasy leagues. He's a very late round pick with really nice upside, but nonetheless not a player to depend on. And then Allen Lazard. I think this one is a bit of a, again, obviously it's a better situation if Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, but I think Allen Lazard sees the lesser of the setback if Jordan Love is the quarterback because Allen Lazard is the more polished player and the more refined player who's able to work underneath. He's used as a big body in the red zone. He can catch touchdown passes down there, and he's caught deep balls as well. So if he's able to use that part of his game, I think he'll have a better fantasy value in lineups than Marquez Valdes-Scantling does if Jordan Love's the QB. But again, we want Aaron Rodgers there. We want him to be throwing the passes to all these receivers because I think that's the best situation for everybody. Nonetheless, it's just important to note that I think that Lazard still has some salvageable value as a late-round pick if Jordan Love is the starter day one for the Packers. And then Amari Rodgers here, I think this is a situation where potentially he doesn't really do anything this season, but I think there's also the potential where he only has to overtake a couple of these guys here. And he's the most pure slot receiver we've seen in Green Bay since Randall Cobb. You see him again there in the backdrop. He's going to be the player that has the best chance to see the most volume after Davante Adams on this football team just because of his close proximity to the quarterback. And Aaron Rodgers loved having that slot receiver weapon, loved having a guy who did the dirty work and got the routes done underneath. That'll be super beneficial. I think this works out even if Jordan Love is the quarterback. The thing I would project here is that if Jordan Love does start day one, I think we might honestly see an Amari Rodgers overtake a player like a Marquez Valdes-Scantling because while I think MVS has a really nice role and has the capability of making those splash plays, it might be more beneficial for a more raw quarterback and a player who's unrefined throwing the ball deep to have a option closer to him running underneath routes and just moving the chains in that phase of the game. So if Love's the quarterback, I would say Amari Rodgers, Allen Lazard, Davante Adams, that's your top 3 that you go with. If Aaron's the QB, I think it gets a bit more murky, and it's just kind of Davante Adams and the rest of the guys. You stream them depending on who's healthy because I think he can give fantasy value to whoever's out there on the field. But overall, I think that in the receiving game, this is an offense that we expect major regression from this season. They're still going to be productive in fantasy, probably a top 5 unit in the league. But, well, that's if Rodgers is the quarterback, obviously. I think you move them back down to that 10 to 12 range if Love is the quarterback. So to kind of summarize things here, I think the running game sees an uptick for the Packers this season. I think they trend back to those 2019 numbers and less away from the down year they had in 2020 with Aaron Jones elevating his fantasy potential and production. And then I think from the receiving game, Davante Adams remains as your constant, your wide receiver one that's either going to command a ton of targets or be a super efficient player nonetheless with a slightly lower target count. And then I think the rest of the players here, it's kind of a wishy-wash scenario, but depending on who the quarterback is, I see value playing out in different ways for these different players. All right, so that was the first time we ever tried a video like that. It was a bit long, and it was kind of tough to navigate throughout the different situations with quarterbacks here, but let me know in the comment section if you enjoyed this team style overview fantasy video. If you guys liked it, I'll definitely try it again in the future and try and get maybe one of these or two of these out a week. So let me know in the comment section below. Again, subscribe and like this video if you're new around here to the channel. I mean, you should like the video regardless if you're new or not, because it would make my day. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to today's video. I'll see you next time. Peace out.